My very great pleasure to introduce Professor Cath Mercer, Professor of Sexual Health Science at UCL. We've worked together indirectly. I'm sure she's going to give us a really interesting talk on building the evidence base for sexual health. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this Bradford Hill seminar today. It's a real honour and privilege to be here, and especially to be here in person. The novelty of in-person talks is still with me. Yeah, I know we're past COVID, but I still get excited to be able to talk to people face to face. So yeah, this is what I'm going to be talking about today, and so I thought a good place to start would be.
The functioning device.
It was working 3 minutes ago. Yeah.
Or you have to click, I would imagine, just click on the slide. Oh, yes.
There. Okay, let's see how we go with that. So just to start with an obvious question, why do sex and sexual and reproductive health matter? Surely this is a personal, private area of health that we shouldn't be looking to investigate. Well, that certainly is the opinion of Margaret Thatcher, who made the headlines back in September 1989, when she decided that the government would not be funding the first national survey of sexual attitudes and lifestyles, despite the evidence from scientists and from doing pilot work to show that such a survey was needed because of the emergence of HIV/AIDS. Margaret Thatcher thought such a survey would invade the privacy of the 20,000 people due to be questioned. But spoiler alert, the funding was secured from the Wellcome Trust, and the first NatSurvey could and did go ahead. But aside from Margaret Thatcher's thoughts on doing sexual reproductive health research, we know that sexual and reproductive health cause significant morbidity. In England alone, last year, nearly 400,000 STI diagnoses, new STI diagnoses were made. But we also know that sexual and reproductive health has come a long way since a focus just on bugs and babies. The Guttmacher Lancet Commission really considered sexual reproductive health and rights far more broadly, as you can see. And so we think about this topic being more than, as I said, bugs and babies, but thinking about, for example, sexual pleasure and sexual well-being and what that means for a satisfying sex life, and also for our general health and well-being. And so it's for these reasons that sex and sexual reproductive health are important, both for individuals, individual health, but also public health. So why do we need sexual and reproductive health to be evidence-based? Well, we know that the public purse is limited and also shrinking. So we know that sexual and reproductive health services and interventions need to be evidence-based to ensure that we get the best bang for our buck, if you like. And so we can see a number of sexual and reproductive health interventions that have used data to inform their planning and in their evaluation. But I'd recognise HIV as the real catalyst for, if you like, legitimising the study of sex and sexual reproductive health back in the late 80s, so that we can get reliable evidence. I say we can get reliable evidence, but this is incredibly challenging to get. Why? Well, obviously, sexual behaviours are private, as Margaret Thatcher recognised, and so they're not directly observable. So we rely on what people choose to report, what they choose to tell us. And so, given that some sexual behaviours are socially sensitive, they can be stigmatising, they can be taboo, we need to be really careful in how we plan to get these robust and reliable data. We need to recognise too that often sexual behaviours are poorly defined. So what do we mean, for example, by what is a sexual partner? Is it someone that you're in a relationship with, or is it someone that you have sex with? You know, there are different interpretations. Similarly, what is sex? What do we mean by sex? Is it any genital contact, or is it specifically penetrative intercourse? So different interpretations, different definitions, and so a need for some consistency in how we address these topics. Plus, sex, sexual behaviour, and humans more broadly are complicated. So we need to sometimes use multiple questions to really dig down and understand what's going on. So, for example, when we're interested in sexual partner concurrency, whether sexual partners overlap in time, so the risk of STI transmission, we can't use just one question worded like, have you cheated? We can use it socially loaded, but also concept like concurrency is quite a complicated one to unpack. We also know that it's challenging to get this evidence because the consequences and the context of sexual behaviours are also complicated. So the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission have this lovely Venn diagram demonstrating how the different elements of sexual reproductive health and rights are multidimensional, but also how there's intersectionality. So we need to think carefully about how we get data, how we ask the questions to get the data that really speak to these complexities. Ultimately, we need quality evidence, and that means methods that increase response and reduce bias. Simple. And one study that has tried to do this, despite Margaret Thatcher's best efforts to survey in the late 80s, has been Britain's National Surveys of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, or NATSAL for short. Now, I'm going to be referring to this study quite a lot during my talk, so I thought it might be helpful just to have one slide of a bit of a 101 as to what is NATSAL, so we're all on the same page. So they're national probability sample surveys, so they're designed to be broadly representative of the general population. And this means using a sample design that uses the postcode address file to randomly select addresses from across the country and then randomly select one person from that randomly selected address to invite to participate in an interview. This approach has been used 3 times to date, the first in being in 1990. So we've got a repeat cross-sectional study design. And as such, by the time that NATSAL 3 was undertaken in 2010, over 45,000 men and women had participated. Typically, this involves around about a 50-minute interview. It's interviewer-led, or has been interviewer-led. I'll come back to this. With a self-completion module in the middle for the more sensitive questions on sexual behaviour, sexual partners, and so on, and then ends with another interviewer-led section. Since NATSAL 2, we've collected biological samples to test for STIs. And since NATSAL 2, we've done some data linkage, originally just at an area level. For NATSAL 4, I'll talk about this later on, we're doing individual data linkage as well. And if you'd like more information, then obviously you can have a look at the website. But if you remember nothing else about NATSAL, it's USP, and it's unique because it tells us about the prevalence of infection in the population, how this relates to the uptake of services and interventions. So it's not just about those who use services, but importantly, those who don't use services, and how this relates to demographic and behavioural factors, and then that in turn relates to the prevalence of infections. So it's a USP of the study, and as such, the evidence to come from the 3 rounds of NATSAL to date considered as gold standard by policy makers and practitioners. So what's the problem? So this desire to increase response and reduce bias, so achieving this methodological rigour is neither quick nor cheap. We also know that for a long time, response rates have been declining. By a long time, I mean several decades now. And by all means, response rates aren't the be all and end all in terms of bias. We know that's not necessarily correlated. But even so, this speaks to the increasing challenges of the feasibility of doing studies like NatSal. And I say like NatSal because there are other surveys that use this approach. I'm just focusing on NatSal today because this is the one I'm. And so when we were thinking about NatSal back in 2017, we were thinking, well, actually, given these increasing challenges, do we need to have a rethink about how we do the study? And so Sally Clifton, who's part of the NatSal team, undertook this scoping review, and you can download it through this QR code and find it online. And she identified the key criteria, if you like, that make NatSal the study that it is. And then various options, alternative study designs, in contrast to the first at the top here, which is the method we've used to date. So, for example, we considered using probability-based web or phone panels to run the survey with. And yes, this would be far cheaper, but we had concerns about whether this would minimise sampling and response bias. Would we have sufficient statistical power? So could we get a large enough sample? Could we ask the detailed questions that we need to? Or if it was an online survey, would people not be willing to do more than a 5-10 minute survey? Could we collect biological samples, and could we get people to consent to data linkage, which have become key features of the NatSal surveys? But one thing was for sure, that we wouldn't be able to maintain the time series if we altered the methodology. So as a consequence, we, back in 2017, concluded that the traditional way of doing NatSal was still the best way in terms of maximising response, minimising bias, and robust data. That was then. So fast forward to 2019, 1st of May, the grant starts. We undertake a year-long development phase. We undertake a lot of stakeholder consultation to find out what people want to know from the new NatSal 4, to make sure that it's fit for purpose in terms of the data and evidence that it can deliver. We also spend a lot of time developing new question modules to again make sure the survey NatSal 4 is fit for purpose. And then we're all set to pilot NatSal 4 in May 2020. But then came COVID. So as you can imagine, brakes on. There's no way that we could undertake NatSal 4's pilot at this time with the restrictions in place. But also, taking a step back, I think it's important to recognise sort of the gear change that COVID brought, that the pandemic brought, for how we think about doing population health research. I think it shifted our expectations around the timelines for acquiring evidence. During the pandemic, understandably, we needed evidence yesterday as to risk. We were familiar with weekly COVID surveys. And don't get me wrong, I'm completely supportive of data being collected and disseminated with as short a lag time as possible. But just thinking about the shift in expectations around these timelines for delivering evidence and how that fits with scientific research timelines, especially within academia, thinking about how long it takes to write bids, secure funding, and then when you've got the funding, get ethics permissions, other governance permissions set up, aside from then actually doing the work. So there's a real tension then between needing evidence yesterday and the reality of getting that evidence, and getting that evidence that's as high a quality as possible. I also think that the pandemic shifted expectations as to the public's willingness to participate in research. I think during COVID, there was a lot of research looking at the impact of COVID. And I think people sort of played along. They've certainly played along most of the time in abiding to the rules around restrictions. But I think on the back of that, there's this research fatigue and perhaps some general fatigue about doing things for the public good. So taking part in research studies. And obviously thinking about the NatSal model of having an interviewer come into your home to do an hour-long interview, that certainly has perhaps the acceptability of that has perhaps shifted on the back of COVID. And then the third point there, the reduced size of the survey interviewer workforce. before the pandemic, being an interviewer for surveys like NatSal was actually an attractive option in terms of the flexibility it would give you. But obviously since COVID, we're all used to greater flexibility with our jobs and careers, such that I think a lot of interviewers chose to leave their career and perhaps go for something that was less stressful. Because although the conditions, the flexibility of being an interviewer are very attractive, the challenges of getting people to take part in surveys like NatSal are huge, especially when there's been this reduced willingness to participate in research. So, looking to the future post-pandemic, these challenges that existed pre-COVID and that I think have been exacerbated by the pandemic make me wonder how we're going to do quality population health research going forward. You know, what does this gold standard look like now? And is it actually something that's good enough? And I should just flag the Survey Futures collaboration, which is a huge ESLC funded programme grant that brings together experts in survey research across industry and academia, who are obviously going to be looking at this question in far greater detail than I can do justice today. So that just to flag that is happening at the same time, and I'm delighted that NatSal is able to share some of the learnings into the Survey Futures programme. So, the challenges of the pandemic, but also the opportunities to come from the pandemic. Clearly, COVID, Boris's demand that we all stay at home, that we don't mix, we socially distance, was not going to be compatible with how we plan to do NatSal 4. So we recognised the need to pivot NatSal, but also, and NatSal certainly wasn't alone in this, other population surveys were facing this challenge too. For example, the Health Survey for England, an annual survey, how was it going to, what kind of methodology was it going to adopt during COVID, especially given the amount of uncertainty. Due to pilot NatSal 4 in May 2020, we couldn't, and we were left at the time thinking, well, how long are we on hold for? Are we talking weeks, months? And if restrictions are eased, will they be eased completely, or is this the new normal? We just didn't know. So I accept, as I'm sure we all do, that our research plans seldom go in a straight line, and that the reality is often far more complicated with twists and turns along the way. But I would argue, from my first-hand experience of having to adapt a study like NatSal with the clock ticking, the grant clock was ticking, and we were trying to think about new ways of how we could deliver NatSal on budget, on time, yet there wasn't really the evidence base for these alternatives. And against the backdrop of a pandemic and all the challenges that brought, meant that this reality is probably a little bit of an underestimate of how things were back in 2020, 2021. And so this need to pivot was, yes, it was an opportunity, but it was also a need. But I think, yes, I have the benefit of hindsight, that the opportunities, the needs to come from the pandemic to embrace and explore alternative ways of doing things actually meant that we could pursue some innovation that perhaps wouldn't have happened otherwise. We know it's very difficult to get funding to do methodological research generally, but especially methodological research that on large enough samples to get robust results. So yes, there were challenges, but also there were opportunities. And I think that taking these innovative steps, baby steps, has actually led to some fairly seismic changes in how we think about doing population health research, and in particular surveys like NatSal. So I'm just going to run through some of the pivoting that NatSal was forced to embrace, and hopefully you can see the journey and how the different pivoting led to actually something that's really quite different but provides opportunities for the future. So firstly, pivoting NatSal's focus to NatSal COVID. So having decided that having recognised that we weren't going to be able to pilot NatSal 4, having paused the decennial survey, we also recognised that other studies that were looking at the impact of COVID weren't really too bothered by the impact of COVID on sexual behaviour, sexual relationships, sexual reproductive health need. And I might argue that some of that reluctance to ask about sex and sexual and reproductive health, because it's such a difficult subject to address and to address well. So the NatSal team, not one to twiddle its thumbs, thought, okay, let's address this question. Let's investigate the impact of COVID on sexual behaviour and sexual reproductive health. Obviously, we couldn't use the previous way of doing NatSal, so we thought we'd go with a quota sample using a web panel to get good enough data, the data that would be timely, within budget, and enable us to answer this question. So we developed this 10-minute online self-completion questionnaire. So 10 minutes, in contrast to the 50-minute questionnaire we were used to asking, that was a radical shift. Similarly, going online, relying on people to answer the questions without any interviewer to chivvy them along or to reassure them of the methods around the survey. We weighted the data to the census, so it was not only a quota sample, but in the end, quasi-representative of the population. We also asked participants to consent to recontact for further studies so that we could do some qualitative research to unpack the quantitative findings. And what was really surprising was, despite this being silver standard, if you like, it was considered good enough. Policymakers and practitioners were absolutely thrilled to have some kind of data on this particular topic to help them inform and understand, for example, sexual and reproductive health service use and need. So a really good outcome from this initial pivot. Then there was the recognition that, okay, if we can do NatSal COVID online, do we have to think about doing the decennial study, NatSal 4, using remote modes? And when I say remote modes, I'm thinking either a video interview or maybe a phone interview, so that we could maintain that interviewer role that's so important for achieving participants along the fairly 50-minute journey of doing the study. And again, we considered 3 different models against the original design, taking account of the design features of NatSal that we'd previously identified in the scoping review. And on balance, having taken account of the different design features, we concluded that an in-person interviewer administration was absolutely key, but to give participants the option, instead of just doing it face-to-face, but to use it to do the interview via video or over the phone, according to what restrictions would allow at the time, but also their own personal preference. So this method was essentially the same, so it was as faithful to the original way of doing NatSal as possible. And of note, the actual interview was structured in the same way. And another important feature was that we developed protocols such that we could still collect biological samples, we could still get people to consent to data linkage. So these key elements that have enhanced the survey data over time. We were able to deliver the Cath samples, so using the slightly tweaked way of doing NatSal, either as a in-person interview or using the written modes. I should actually add that the video way of doing NatSal wasn't actually, we did a couple of pilots, and actually hardly anyone chose that option, which I was quite surprised about, because when you think back to lockdown, where everyone suddenly embraced Zoom, I thought, perhaps people would be so familiar and comfortable with that mode of communication that they might prefer to use that rather than an in-person interview. So we actually just went with the remote option as the phone interview as the alternative to the in-person interview. So next pivot that was required was in terms of the sampling frame. So although we had been able to do NatSal 4 with the PAF sample as in previous rounds, we were finding that recruitment was incredibly slow. And we recognised that this is part due to the interview of field force, but also a decline in the willingness of people to do a study like NatSal. And so it became apparent that there was no way that we were going to be able to achieve the target of 8,000 participants on budget and in time. This would take years to get a sample this size. And so we again pivoted the study design, this time to make use of NatSen's probability panel. So people who were originally recruited and who participated in the British Social Attitude Surveys, who agreed to take part in further research, were invited to do the NatSal survey. So there are issues there because it's a sample of the sample, but at the stem, at the origin, is a probability sample, which at that time we thought was superior to just going with the web panel. Having developed the remote mode, so the phone version of NatSal 4, we had that ready to go. But actually the NatSen probability panel, we're used to doing follow-up surveys online, and we hadn't developed an online way of doing NatSal. So we developed a shorter online option for those people who didn't want to do a phone interview. This online version was about 25 minutes. So knowing from NatSal COVID how much you could ask just in 10 minutes, we felt confident that we could capture enough data within this short online survey. Importantly, we were able to get biosamples to get consent to data linkage, having established those protocols previously. So a shift, a pivot towards how we achieved our sampling frame for NatSal 4. And just to let you know that actually the sample to come from the panel was about 50-50 split between those who did the phone interview and those who did it online. But we were still short of the target sample size for NatSal 4. And so given the success of the NatSal COVID study, we decided to explore the option of using a web panel for NatSal 4. We already had an online version of the NatSal 4 survey developed. We have protocols for biosampling, data linkage, and so it just felt like a no-brainer really to run the NatSal 4 survey with this online panel. In part, it would then complement the 2 rounds of the NatSal COVID study that we'd done previously. So there was a recent time series that we could look at with a third wave, if you like, the online panel option. So we got there. But what's more, this pivoting enabled us to capitalise on opportunities to enrich the survey data. So, for example, inviting participants to participate in further research. So, for example, qualitative follow-up studies. And whilst this wasn't something new, we'd, for example, done some qualitative work with men who in NatSal 3 reported paying for sex to look at reasons for paying for sex. But it just meant we sort of our eyes were opened as to what the opportunities were for getting data to enrich and enhance the survey data. It also meant that we could ask particular groups within the NatSal sample to do deeper dive surveys. So, for example, the gay, bisexual and other men who have sex with men, we could ask them to do community-based surveys to get richer data that a survey like NatSal is unable to get because of its general population focus. We also have the opportunity, now we have this standalone online NatSal survey, to run it with other population groups, and in particular those population groups who perhaps aren't well captured by NatSal because it being a general population survey. So I'm thinking, for example, inclusion health groups, not necessarily the NatSal survey, online NatSal survey in its entirety, but perhaps to embed some of those questions within a broader general health survey for these key groups. So as I said, all additional data to enhance and expand what the actual survey collects. But what do we do with all these data? So we've now got over 19,000 participants in NatSal 4 collected across 4 arms of data collection for the survey. So the question then is, can we do anything, and anything that's meaningful? especially given the differences in data type, quality and biases. And I'm thinking about that in terms of all the different types of data that we have, the quali, the bio, the survey. But thinking specifically about the survey data, because that's essentially the heart of the NAPA. Are we dealing with different kinds of apples now? We've got Cox's, Pink Ladies, Braben, or actually the 4 arms of data, are we dealing more with a fruit bowl? We've got different kinds of fruit, apples, orange, bananas. So to what extent can we blend, use the data from across all 4 arms? So this is the question we're grappling with now. In an ideal world, we'd love to be able to look at the data, analyse all the data just in one big pot. But we recognise that there are different sampling frames here. So it might be that we just consider all the probability sample data together. Or because of the different length of questionnaires, is it that we have to look at those who've done the longer version of the survey? Or because of the NatSen panel being a sample from a sample, do we actually treat them all in one? And I think this could be the subject of a future Bradford Hill seminar, because this is work that's going on with Tommy and Danny and Sean. Sorry, Sean, I missed your name off the slide. Just to look at the bias, the extent of bias across the different arms, to figure out how we can use the data, if we can, to come up with some recommendations, running sensitivity analysis. And I'm sure Anne, Tommy, Sean, and Danny can all speak to what's actually involved with this piece of work. But I'm delighted that you guys are on board to help us make sense of these data. So going forward then, and redefining NatCell's gold standard evidence. Yes, the survey data remain at the heart, but given the challenges that we've been facing, recruitment, different modes, but also the increasing recognition that a survey perhaps can't drill down to get the nuanced understanding that we need around sexual behaviour and sexual and reproductive health, then actually is the new gold standard something that, yes, has the survey data at the heart, but actually is enhanced or expanded to give this broader picture of sex and sexual and reproductive health by bringing in the biological data, the qualitative data, and obviously through linkage to routinely collected data that enhance and give a fuller picture of what NatCell can say, such that NatCell isn't about just a survey, rather it's a way of collecting and collating data for individuals, and that data being as high quality as possible. So is this the new gold standard, moving away from just thinking about survey data? But actually, if we're starting to think about data linkage, so for example, the census to the National Pupil Database, to health records, then I guess we can do that for individual participants. But actually, should we be thinking about broadening the range of fruit in the fruit bowl, if I'm going to stick with that analogy, to think about how the various other sources of data that we know are out there can be used to complement what the survey tells us. So surveillance data, census data, data from other research surveys, both in the UK, but other national surveys as well. And should we be thinking outside the box in terms of how we can use retail data, for example, on condom sales or pregnancy test kits? And what role does Google search data have in how we understand sexual and reproductive health service use and need? You know, what could we learn from Google searches on where's my nearest clinic? How can those kinds of data be brought into the mix to help us get this better understanding of what's going on in the population? And then finally, social media data. We know that there's millions and millions of data out there. And okay, there are questions around their quality and their access to these data, but actually going forward, should we be overlooking these data, or do we need to develop methods that can bring them into the fold? So I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of how we might use other data, so data that aren't for the individual participants, rather to provide this population perspective. So this is some work that Kirsty Mitchell led with colleagues from the Nassau COVID team and at UKHSA, basically comparing what we saw in the Nassau survey, so the Nassau 3 survey in 2010 and the Nassau COVID survey in 2021, which was the second wave, which looked back over the first year of the pandemic, and how the trends relate to what was observed from surveillance data from 2010 through to 2019. And it's sort of reassuring that both sources suggest that the pandemic contributed to lower than expected rates for these outcomes. So viewing the surveillance data in parallel to the survey data. We can also use census data, surveillance data, and so on to provide context to help us understand what's going on at the local level. So, for example, taking account an area's demography from census data, for example, its age structure, ethnic mix, the prevalence of different sexual identities, and then to use data from Nassau to speak to that particular demography, because we know that Nassau isn't powered to look at a regional level or more local level. So we need to, I think creatively about bringing in data from, for example, the census to help us make sense at a local level, whilst using data on the detailed sexual behaviours that's captured by Nassau. And this speaks to how there's no one size fits all approach to sexual and reproductive health needs. You know, different types of areas and populations, inner city, suburban, semi-rural, they have different population structures, different service opportunities. And so we need to bring these together through modelling, I think, to come up with something that's a bit more bespoke. And I've just put here this, you know, if we're thinking about using mathematical models, then can we enhance these by taking account of, for example, geomapping data to take account of the location of services relative to where people live, you know, the extent to which transport facilitates or hinders access to services and travel times, so on. I think there's also a role for using Natsal in parallel to other surveys to provide greater statistical power. So, for example, for groups where one population survey can't provide sufficient participants in one group. So an example is heterosexual identifying men who have sex with men. So we know that men who have sex with men are of particular interest in terms of their sexual and reproductive health needs, because they experience a disproportionate burden of poor sexual health. And in particular, those who identify as heterosexual may be missing out on health promotion messages and so on, which tend to be targeted more towards gay and bisexual MSM. So a group that's of particular interest, but who are relatively small. So Natsal 3, for example, of the 190 MSM in the Natsal 3 survey, we found 45, so just about a quarter, who identified as heterosexual. So 45 doesn't really give us enough statistical power to say anything meaningful about this population group. But through doing individual participant data meta-analysis, IPD meta-analysis, using data from a range of surveys, then actually we can perhaps say something more meaningful for population groups like this. And this is a little summary of some work that a PhD student of mine, by Curtis, put together for his PhD. Who entirely was looking at this particular population group. And although in the end he didn't use the data from Natsal, he did combine data from community surveys of gay men, achieving a sample of nearly 200,000 MSM and a sample of almost over 1,000 heterosexual identifying MSM. So a way to get some more robust data evidence for this particular population group. But this is absolutely critical. And I think this speaks not just to this issue of IPD meta-analysis, but more generally when we're talking about how we use the fruit bowl of data. We need to be careful when we're combining data from different sources, different quality, and with different limitations. Because it's not a level playing field. So what does that look like? So I think it's really important that we are transparent. So what's in our fruit bowl, what's in our fruit salad, which particular fruit, what do we need to know about them, how have they been put together? So just to be upfront about the assumptions that we're making about the data, what we know about the bias, and to, just to be transparent and clear that in order to have this broader picture, we've had to bring in data from across the piece. And I think this need for transparency is particularly important when we're using more sophisticated methods, including AI, because there's a greater potential for them being perceived as creating a black box. We often think about how we might present the results from mathematical models in a user-friendly way, assuming that people don't want to know what's going on in the black box. But then we quite often find that people won't use the outcomes, use that evidence, because there's a lack of trust as to what's going on within that black box. And I know, Liz, this is something that you're working on at the moment, so really keen to find out what you learn from how we package findings from using more sophisticated models. But I think the bottom line is we need to work hard to try and overcome skepticism and distrust, because otherwise all these efforts to bring together data in a creative way are going to be maybe not wasted, but of limited use. So very briefly, what does this look like in practice? Well, for us as researchers, if we can use harmonised measures where possible, that's an obvious starting point, but there are obviously various challenges to doing that. Studies like NatSal, which are asking a particular question in a particular way for 3-4 rounds, may be reluctant to change how it asks that question in order to align with other surveys. But maybe that's something that we could work together to achieve as a scientific community. We need to, I think, understand what stakeholders want to know to trust the outcomes, the models, the black boxes, and not to make assumptions as to what that is. There's the need to know, there's the nice to know, and what that might be for us may very well be different for the end user. And I think this is particularly true for the public when we're thinking about recommendations, health promotion messaging. Where does that come from? If this is an outcome, an output for the public, then what do they need to know about the assumptions and limitations of the data that have resulted in this recommendation? And so some public patient interaction engagement activities are really important to get buy-in from the public as a stakeholder. And then finally, funders. I think it's encouraging that there's been increasing recognition in the need to communicate methods well and beyond academic audiences, and that this is reflected in how funding is awarded. Quite often there's funding that's dedicated for public engagement activities, and I think that's hugely encouraging that there's this recognition of research and evidence being of use and of benefit beyond the academic community. So to conclude, and hopefully allow some time for some discussion, I'm just going to reflect on those two earlier questions. The first being, do we need to rethink how we do quality population health research going forward? And I think the answer is no, because I'd argue that the challenges and opportunities for innovation already existed pre-pandemic. So the challenges, I think, have been exacerbated by the pandemic and increased. But I also think that the need to pivot research and to pivot how we think and do studies like NatSal have actually enabled us to demonstrate some innovation that has the potential to be taken forward to help us address some of these challenges. So if you like, COVID provided a catalyst to address these challenges and to make us think outside of the box, to make us think beyond, for example, NatSal just being about a survey. And what does gold standard evidence now look like? Some people might say, is it quantity now over quality? And I don't think it is, because I think there isn't, and there never has been, a perfect one-size-fits-all evidence source. All data or evidence have their limitations. And I think gold standard evidence is now about acknowledging these limitations, but also the need to pool data from a variety of sources so that the whole is more than the sum of its parts to get that broader picture for the population. So thank you for staying with me on this journey, and also thank you to the NatSal 4 team, including my co-PI Pam Sonnenberg and the NatSal colleagues over the years, over the last 30 years, including colleagues now here at Cambridge, and also thank you to colleagues at UCL and UKHSA. So thank you for listening, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Very, very interesting. So we'll open up the floor to questions. Anyone want to? Sean? Or Anthony's, whichever one to go first.
I'll take it. They have an argument. No, thank you very much. We've been thinking about these ideas for many years now, because we didn't have, in anything that we were doing, we didn't have the nut sound. So we always had the availability of bits and pieces of sources of data, you know, from anywhere, which we had to reconcile. But I agree with you, is not. It's very important, I think, to have, at least at the core, something that is a gold standard, because in all our efforts, you know, it was impossible. It was clear that it was impossible to triangularize, or whatever you want to call it, assimilate data if you don't have an anchor. So if you don't have something that, although small, but can give you
Unbiased.
Yeah, well, an unbiased, let's call it unbiased, but yes, an unbiased baseline. And then everything else can be related to that. So you can say, this has got this type of bias, and you can model and have some information, expert information on the relative biases with respect to the sort of this gold standard. So
I guess that's what I'm asking is, you know, what is that gold standard looking like now? So we know that response rates have declined. We know that it's increasingly costly to do a survey like NatSal. So actually, is there a trade-off between having a survey that happens just once every 10 years?
maybe smaller.
Smaller, yeah.
Smaller, more focused, but ensuring that, you know, that kind of anchor is there.
I agree that there needs to be an anchor.
Yes.
So what I'm arguing is, I'm not sure what that looks like.
Yes, I understand.
And I think there is, you know, if we go for something that's more thorough, then it's not something we can do all that regularly. With COVID, as I said, shifting timelines, is it that people would rather go for the silver standard, but more regularly than the gold standard, especially if that gold standard is no longer as gold and shiny as it used to be?
Yeah, maybe you have to redesign the gold standard definitely into maybe something more feasible, smaller, and which doesn't require the request or the response. Anyway, I'll leave decided to.
Sure.
Sorry. I just wondered whether there's a conversation around. Well, my question was initially going to be about whether there was a conversation around paying people to take part in these conversations, the pros and cons of doing that. But then I thought, well, maybe there are other ways of motivating people to participate in surveys. So the presumption in the past seems to have been that people will be motivated to just help out, provide an evidence base, help out
Good of society.
good of society.
Yes.
And presumably people are a bit less motivated to do that, but they're motivated to do other things instead. One might be to earn money, but there might be all kinds of motivations like earn money for charities, or I really don't know. I just wonder whether there was a conversation around that sort of area.
I think you're right, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the areas that the Survey Futures programme is looking at. How could we incentivise participation? Not that we would use the word incentivise on an ethics application, but I mean, back with NatSal 3, when we had concerns about the response rate then, and that was 58%, we did play with varying the token of appreciation, and actually had very little difference in terms of response rate. So my hunch is that if someone's going to do a survey like NatSal, they're going to do it whether you pay them or not, and regardless of the amount, because they're that way inclined. So trying to think about other ways to engage people, think about going beyond just survey participant. It's going to be a certain kind of person that isn't going to be representative of the population. It's hugely challenging. But yes, I'd keep an eye on the Survey Futures programme.
What is the Survey Futures programme? Who's involved in that?
So it's an Economic Social Research Council funded programme of work that runs through to 2026, and it brings together experts from survey research, industry and academic organisations, just to explore this idea. Can we go online? How do we get robust results and data, even if we use online methods in contrast to the interview administered way of doing studies like NatSal? What's the role of the incentive? How else can we supplement data? So a lot of what I've been talking about today, but it's actually pulling together the evidence from a range of surveys that have tried to pivot as a result of the pandemic.
Workshops, I would guess.
Yes, yeah.
Hi, I had a look at my records and I found that the first paper that I used that you'd written was from 2007. So thank you very much for writing that paper. It's been extraordinarily useful. Developed an area around sexual minority women, because the finding was that there was a higher rate of heterosexual sex in sexual minority women under the age of 16, and that spawned a whole area around higher rates of teenage pregnancy, higher rates of cervical cancer, which you would have never have known when you did the paper in 2007. So I was going to ask you, the COVID survey, did you have anything around sexual orientation in the COVID survey?
That's about sexual identity.
Yeah, okay.
Data on sexual behaviour with same-sex partners, opposite-sex partners, and sexual attraction as well. So we've captured the 3 dimensions of sexual orientation.
Have you managed to publish anything by sexual orientation?
I'm pretty sure that the key findings were in part stratified by sexual orientation, at least by sexual identity.
Right.
So it might be worth having a look at
okay.
outputs. And if you can't find what you need, then just
I'll get back to you. Okay, because the government and ONS never published anything at all by sexual orientation around COVID. And we're still looking for some decent data about what actually happened during COVID. And we're in 2024 now. So I'll have a look if there is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering, I know there's a big push globally now for considering sexual and reproductive health across the life, with menopause or older cisgender women. And I was quite interested that NatSal 4 still has that cut-off at, I think, 70, is it?
59.
59.
Yes.
I was wondering if, firstly, there was any plan to roll out this new Ipsos survey in older postmenopausal women, or if there's any plan in NatSal 5 and beyond to kind of extend that age range further up. Why does that age range still currently exist?
First of all, in terms of NatSal 5, not sure what that's going to look like, so let's park that. But in terms of the age range for NatSal 4 being 16 to 59, in contrast to NatSal 3, which was 16 to 74, that was one of the really tricky decisions we had to make, given the limited resource, to do we go back to 74 or older, or in the end we decided to use some resource to do an ethnic minority boost sample possible to get richer data by the key ethnic minority groups within the UK. So it's been some really difficult decisions and trade-offs between to help us come up with the study design for NatSal-4 and the target population, how that's defined. I think it's worth saying that one of the justifications for stopping at 59 is to take account of the other surveys that exist. For example, the English longitudinal study in ageing, which I think starts at 50, includes some questions on sex and sexual and reproductive health needs. So older people would perhaps be picked up there. But I think another pivoting opportunity for NatSal is to perhaps run the survey with older people sort of recruited through the Ipsos web panel, or to go back to the NatSen panel, where actually the age range, the age structure of the panel sample actually skewed towards older people. So there's an abundance of older people who we could quite easily run the NatSal-4 survey with to get data for that particular population group. So still lots of opportunities to look at this older people, but to date, just sort of trying to please as many stakeholders as possible meant that we stopped at 59. And I think it's also important to just acknowledge that by pivoting, whilst the age range was 16 to 59, the panel only includes people from age 18 and older, both the NatSen probability panel and the Ipsos web panel. So a real challenge for NatSal-4 is having not all that many 16 and 17-year-olds, because they could only be recruited through the PAF sample. So that's got an issue at the younger ages as well as the older ages. But yeah, a really good point, and one we often come back to, and sometimes ourselves for not being bolder and extending the age range, but it was due to a limited resource to deliver this round of NatSal.
We have a question online. Sheila, would you like to unmute it?
Yes, Sheila Bird. Thank you very much. Most interesting presentation. And I think NatSal should take some encouragement from the fact that your probability sample achieved a 25% response rate, whereas the community infection survey and REACT, also probability samples during COVID, were achieving only of the order of 10 to 15%. So NatSal is doing something right even now, and you're also higher than the labour force survey, and you are, like REACT, requiring a biological sample. So I was particularly interested in the remarks you made about what are the questions that are of interest to stakeholders, and what are the questions that are of interest to the public, to your potential respondents, or the people whom you want to respond. And I think review of the balance of those questions would be particularly important, because a policy, there is a tendency, there has been a recent tendency for the design of surveys to be driven by what ministers want for policy formation, whereas the ethos of the Office for National Statistics and the UK Statistics Act is that national surveillance studies, national studies, are for the public to hold ministers to account. And the best way to get a high response rate is to ensure that the questions that interest the public come up pretty quickly in the survey layout, rather than as an afterthought. So I wonder if you, or indeed if the Survey Futures is doing any work to look at the balance of which questions are of interest to policymakers and which questions are of interest to my respondents. Because in a way, you've identified that you can't, at the moment, tap into 16 and 70-year-olds who may have concerns about access to pornography and how that changes sexual behaviour and hence sexual risks. And it may also, Yeah,
I was going to say, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's important for us to recognise that the public are one of the key stakeholders for NatSal. So traditionally, we may have thought about pleasing and meeting the needs of policymakers and practitioners. But we know that NatSal has played a really important role in facilitating the public dialogue and conversation around sex. And so it's really important for us to tune in and to think about outputs beyond just reports for ministers, as you say, but to also make the data accessible to the public and the findings accessible to the public. So it's back to this question about understanding their needs and developing something that speaks to their needs. And there is some work that we're actually already doing, looking at how we share those data in a lay-friendly way that enables people to understand the science behind the data so that they can trust what the data are telling them, the recommendations that we are putting together for the public. I think it's also worth recognising that when we've tried to, if you like, sell the survey on the doorstep, so when interviewers are knocking on doors, inviting people to take part, they are highly trained in that they can speak to areas of NatSal that they think that a potential participant may find particularly interesting. So if it is a younger person, then maybe something around learning about sex, or as you say, pornography. Where if it's someone who's perhaps older or clearly pregnant, then it may be something about reproductive health. So just to try and tune in, make the survey clear, well, to show that the survey is relevant to people of all walks of life. So yeah, not sure if that answers your question, but just to say that the public are very much up there in terms of being a key stakeholder, and they were consulted as part of our stakeholder consultation process in the first year of the study, where a third of our responses as to what NatSal should look like, NatSal4 should look like, actually came from the public. So hopefully the public's voices has been incorporated into the design and the delivery of NatSal4.
thank you.
Thank you. Just checking if there's any other questions online. Okay, I think we'll officially end there, but I'm sure Cath will be happy to have any further discussions or answer any further questions in the next few minutes.
Sure.
Public that are being consulted, because I can imagine that there will be special interest groups who would have very strong opinions, but their views wouldn't be of great interest to a lot of the people who are being asked to participate in the survey.
Well, it might depend. So, for example, we engaged with organisations working with gender diverse people. We've interacted with disability charities. They're just two examples off my head. And so, yes, they are speaking to particular population groups, but the consultation will to the public, and the third of responses that I referred to that was coming from the public were individual members of the public. So granted, they may have a particular agenda, but beyond doing something more
Carrying out a survey.
yes, aside from doing a survey. Yeah, but we so for example, one of the public facing tools that we've created using the NatSal3 data in partnership with the Open University enables people to play around with the data in aggregate form to see with a variety of variables and to feed back, what they would like to have had more of or what they found particularly interesting. So, I guess, it's a case of take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So how do you kind of get people who aren't particularly interested in sexual reproductive health to come forward and say, well, I think NatSal4 should address X, Y, and Z? It's challenging. So yeah. So yeah, we try. We can only try.
Thank you very much, Cath, and thank you all for attending this.